This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Some cases don't begin with suspicion. They begin with ordinary life, with mornings that pass without being marked, afternoons that blur into routine, and nights that settle quickly, without anything to distinguish them from the ones before. Nothing stands out. Nothing signals what is coming. And for people living inside those moments, there is no sense that anything is different. No awareness that these ordinary hours will later be examined, replayed, and questioned, as if something important must have been hiding inside them. But most of the time there isn't. Only time moving forward the way it does. This is one of those cases. Not one that begins with a crime scene, not one that begins with an investigation, but one that begins inside a home. A home that over the course of 10 years will see the birth of 4 children and the deaths of all 4. Before any of that, there is Kathleen, born in 1967. Her early life is not defined by stability, it's defined by rupture. When she's still a young child, her mother is killed by her father. There is no gradual lead up to something like that, no time to understand it as it unfolds. One moment, a family structure exists, and the next, it's gone. Her father is imprisoned, and what follows is not a single stable environment. It's movement. Different homes, different carers, different expectations. No continuity. No single place that holds long enough to feel permanent. Childhood in that context doesn't unfold in a straight line. It fragments. And those fragments don't necessarily reconnect. By the time she reaches adulthood, she is living in New South Wales, trying in whatever way she can to build something that resembles stability. And that's when she meets Craig Folbigg. There's nothing remarkable about the meeting, no dramatic beginning, no moment that would later feel significant. Just 2 people crossing paths in an ordinary setting and staying. The relationship forms gradually, quietly, without attention, without anything that would later stand out as unusual. They marry. They move into a home together, and from the outside, their life follows a familiar pattern. Work, routine, plans for the future, and the expectation of children. A standard domestic life. And then their first child is born, Caleb Gibson Folbigg. At the beginning of life, everything is small. Movements are small, sounds are small, even presence feels small, contained within the space of a room, within the arms of the person holding them. A newborn doesn't exist independently. They exist entirely through care, through feeding, through being held and being watched over. Days are structured around them. Sleep cycles, night feeds, moments of quiet. The kind of rhythm that can feel exhausting but also grounding, because it gives shape to time. For 19 days, that is Caleb's world. 19 days of being held, bed, settled, and watched. 19 days of existence that never extends beyond that early fragile stage. And then, on the 20th of February 1999, he dies. There is no clear cause, no visible injury, no explanation that can be pointed to and understood, only classification: sudden infant death syndrome. A term that exists not to explain, but to acknowledge that no explanation could be found. At that point, there is no suspicion, no broader narrative, only loss. The kind of loss that doesn't come with answers, only questions that cannot be resolved. And still, life continues because it has to, even when it feels like it shouldn't. Less than a year later, another child is born, Patrick Alan Folbigg. From early on, Patrick's life is different. There is concern, not constant, but present. He experiences seizures, episodes that interrupt the expected rhythm of infancy, moments that require attention, medical assessment, and intervention. There are hospital visits, monitoring, doctors observing, testing, trying to understand what is happening. But there is no single diagnosis, no clear condition that explains everything, only symptoms, only uncertainty. And in between those moments, there is still ordinary life, feeding, holding, watching, the quiet routines that continue even when something feels unstable underneath them. Patrick grows, he responds, exists within that space between concern and hope, until the 13th of February 1991. He is 8 months old and he dies. Again, there is no definitive explanation, no clear cause that can be identified with certainty. 2 children, 2 deaths. At this point, there is still no unified narrative, no pattern being formally established, only 2 separate events, both unresolved. And inside the home, life continues again, because stopping is not something life allows. In 1992, their 3rd child is born, Sarah Kathleen Folbigg. And for a time, things appear different. Sarah develops as expected. She feeds, she grows. She moves through early milestones without the same medical concerns that surrounded Patrick. There are moments that feel normal, small, everyday moments. The kind that don't seem significant while they're happening. Being placed down to sleep, being picked up again. The quiet sounds of movement in another room. Moments that later become the ones people think back to, wondering if anything about them was different. But at the time, they're just moments. And maybe, for a while, there is a sense that whatever happened before is not repeating, that something has shifted. That possibility ends on the 30th of August, 1993. Sarah is 10 months old and she dies. 3 children, 3 losses. Each one recorded, each one medically classified, each one without a definitive explanation. And still, treated individually, not yet connected, not yet understood as part of a single narrative. Time passes again, years this time. And then in 1997, another child is born. Laura Elizabeth Folbigg. And this time, something changes. Laura grows beyond infancy, and she becomes a toddler. She walks, she moves independently, she interacts with her environment and responds to people. At this stage, a child is no longer just being cared for, they begin to assert presence, preferences, reactions, and recognition. There are likely routines by now, patterns to the day, moments that repeat. And for a time, the pattern of loss does not return, not in the same way, not within the same time frame, which makes what happens next feel even more difficult to reconcile. On the 1st of March 1999, Laura dies. She's 18 months old. 4 children, 4 deaths, each one occurring within the same household, each one without a definitive cause that explains why. And it is here that the weight of the pattern begins to settle, not all at once, but gradually. Inside the home, things begin to change. Silence becomes more noticeable, not constant, but present. Conversations shorten, distance develops, not necessarily through conflict, but through accumulation, loss without explanation, grief without resolution. And somewhere within that space, Kathleen begins to write. Not for an audience, not for record, not with the intention of ever being read, just to place something outside of herself. Because when thoughts stay internal for too long, they begin to repeat. They circle. They return to the same place over and over again without resolution. Writing becomes a way to interpret that, a way to take something intangible and give it form, even if that form is incomplete, even if it doesn't resolve anything. The entries are not structured, they don't follow a timeline, they don't attempt to explain events. They move in fragments, feelings rather than facts. Moments of self-reflection that don't lead anywhere beyond themselves. And within those entries, there is a pattern. Not of events, but of emotion. I feel like I'm the worst mother in the world. I keep thinking this is my fault. I don't understand why this keeps happening. The same ideas returning, rephrased, revisited, not as statements of certainty, but as expressions of something unresolved. Because grief, especially repeated grief, doesn't move in a straight line. It doesn't begin, progress, and end. It loops. And within those loops, self-blame is not unusual. It becomes a way to try to make sense of something that doesn't have a clear explanation. If something terrible keeps happening, then maybe it must be caused by something. And if no external cause can be identified, the focus turns inward. not because there's proof, but because the absence of explanation demands something to fill it. At this stage, those words remain private, contained within notebooks, within pages that are never intended to leave the space they were written in. But that changes in 2001 when Craig Folbigg takes those diaries and gives them to police. There's something about cases like this. The more you hear, the harder it is to look away. Because this isn't just content. It's real people, real stories, and most of the time they fade. This show exists so they don't fade. And the only reason it keeps existing is because there are people listening right now who choose to keep it going. Not everyone does, but the ones who do, they're the reason these stories get told properly. So if you've ever listened and felt like this matters, there's a way to be part of that. There's a Patreon, and there's merch on the website. No pressure, but if you know, you know. Now let's go back to what happened next. It's a moment that shifts everything. Because for the first time, something that existed entirely inside the home moves out of it. And once it does, it's no longer interpreted within the context it was written in. It becomes something else, evidence. At the same time, the deaths of all 4 children are re-examined. Medical records are brought together not as separate cases, but as a collective. And when they are viewed side by side, a pattern begins to take shape. Not because anything new has occurred, but because everything is now being seen in relation to everything else. 4 deaths, 1 family. And that changes how the case is understood. What were once individual tragedies begin to be interpreted as something connected, not proven, but suggested. And from that point forward, the case no longer exists within private grief. It enters the legal system. Kathleen is interviewed and questioned over and over again.
Are you responsible for the death of Caleb?
No.
Are you responsible for the death of Pat?
No.
Are you responsible for the death of Sarah?
No.
And are you responsible for the death of Laura?
No.
In 2003, the case goes to trial. Inside the courtroom, the narrative is no longer fragmented. It is structured, ordered, presented in a way that creates continuity. 4 children, 4 deaths, 1 household. The prosecution builds its case not around a single act, but around accumulation. There is no eyewitnesses, no direct physical evidence of harm occurring in a specific moment. Instead, the argument is built on probability. That the likelihood of 4 children dying unexpectedly within one family is so low that coincidence alone cannot explain it. And this becomes central. Because when there is no direct evidence, interpretation fills the space. The diaries are introduced, not as personal writing, but as material to be examined. Selected entries are read aloud. I feel like I'm the worst mother in the world. I keep thinking this is my fault. I don't understand why this keeps happening. The words are the same, but the context has completely changed. What was once private reflection is now placed under scrutiny. The prosecution does not present them as explicit confessions. Instead, they suggest something more subtle. That when these words are viewed alongside the pattern of deaths, they may indicate internal awareness. Not directly stated, but implied. And that implication becomes powerful, because it allows interpretation without requiring certainty. The defence responds differently. They argue that grief is not rational, that self-blame is a known psychological response in parents who experience loss, that writing like this is not evidence of guilt, but evidence of distress. They emphasise what is not present. No physical proof, no confirmed mechanism, no direct causation established. And so two narratives exist within the same set of facts. One that sees pattern as evidence of intent, and one that sees pattern as tragedy without explanation. The jury must choose between those interpretations. In May 2003, they return a verdict. Guilty. 3 counts of murder, 1 count of manslaughter. The decision brings legal finality, but not clarity. Because the case was never built on a single definitive piece of evidence. It was built on accumulation, on interpretation, on what the pattern appeared to suggest. Kathleen Folbigg is sentenced to a lengthy term of 40 years imprisonment. And for years, that's where the case remains. Legally resolved, but not universally settled. Because outside the courtroom, questions continue. Not necessarily about what happened, about how certain anyone can be about what happened. Over time, attention begins to shift. Not suddenly, not in a way that changes everything overnight, but gradually. Because science does not stay still. What cannot be explained in one decade can begin to make sense in another. And in cases like this, that matters. Because the original conclusions were built not only what was known, but on what wasn't, on the limits of medical understanding at the time. And as those limits begin to move, so does the foundation of the case itself. Researchers begin to examine sudden unexplained death in infants with new tools, new methods, and new frameworks. Genetic testing becomes more advanced, more precise, more capable of identifying conditions that previously went undetected. And within that expanding field of knowledge, certain patterns begin to emerge. Rare genetic mutations, conditions affecting the heart, disruptions in electrical signaling that can occur without warning, sometimes without leaving any visible trace. Among these, are variants linked to the CALM2 gene, a gene involved in regulating calcium within cardiac cells, a process that, when functioning normally, keeps the heart beating in a steady, controlled rhythm. And when it doesn't, that rhythm can become unstable, in some cases fatally so, particularly in infants and young children, where the first sign of a problem can be sudden collapse, without prior indication, without a clear external cause. This does not create certainty. It does not reconstruct events. It does not explain each death with precision. But it does introduce something that didn't exist before. A plausible mechanism. A possibility that aligns with unexplained outcomes. And once that possibility exists, the case begins to change, not in its facts, but in its interpretation. Experts begin to review the evidence again, not to prove innocence, not to assign guilt, but to ask a different question. Given what is now known, can the original conclusions still be supported to the same level of certainty? And for many, the answer becomes less clear. Pathologists revisit the medical findings. Geneticists analyse available data. Paediatric specialists examine patterns of infant illness and death. And gradually, concern begins to grow. Not unanimous agreement, but enough uncertainty to matter. Enough to challenge the idea that the case was ever resolved beyond reasonable doubt. Because the original trial did not have access to this information. It couldn't consider what had not yet been discovered. And so the question shifts again. Not only what happened, but also what could not have been known at the time, and whether a conclusion reached without that knowledge can still stand. Over the years, support builds for reconsideration. From within the scientific community, from legal advocates, and from those who believe the case was decided on interpretation rather than certainty. And eventually, that pressure leads somewhere. In 2023, after extensive review, new scientific material is presented. Expert opinions, genetic findings, reassessments of medical evidence, all of it considered together. And for the first time since the original trial, the case is viewed through a fundamentally different lens. One shaped not by the limitations of the early 2000s, but by the expanded understanding of the present. And the outcome changes. After 20 years in prison, Kathleen Folbigg is granted an unconditional pardon. She is released from prison. Shortly after, her convictions are formally quashed. Legally, the case no longer holds. Not because a definitive alternative explanation has replaced the original one, but because the level of certainty required to sustain the conviction can no longer be met. The standard has shifted, and the case cannot meet it. But even here, even with that outcome, there is no complete resolution, because the central question has not been answered in absolute terms, not fully, not in a way that removes all doubt, and maybe it never will be, because some cases do not end with clarity. They end in a space between possibilities, a space where multiple explanations exist, but none can be proven with complete certainty. And within that space, it becomes easy to focus on the complexity, the legal arguments, the scientific developments, the shifting interpretations. But underneath all of that, at the centre of everything, are 4 children. Caleb, 19 days old. A life that existed entirely within the earliest stage of being. Held, fed, known only in the smallest, most fragile moments. Patrick, 8 months old. A life marked by medical uncertainty, moments of distress, and moments of care. A presence that existed between concern and hope. Sarah, 10 months old. A life that, for a time, appeared to move forward without interruption. Small milestones, quiet progress, moments that felt ordinary. Laura, 18 months old. A child who moved beyond infancy, who walked, who interacted, who began to exist with independence. 4 lives, not statistics, not evidence, children. Each one experiencing the world in the limited time they had. Each one existing within moments that at the time felt like any other. And maybe that's the part that sits heaviest. Not just that they died, but that while they were still alive, there was no sense of how little time there would be. No awareness that those ordinary days were all there would ever be. Cases like this don't leave behind clean endings. They don't resolve in a way that feels complete. Because even when legal outcomes change, even when scientific understanding evolves, there are still gaps, still unknowns, still questions that cannot be answered with certainty. And so the case remains, not in the courtroom, but in that space between what is known and what may never be fully understood. If you feel that weight, there are ways to support the show. Patreon, merch, and spreading awareness. No pressure, but for every listener who carries these stories, ensures they do not disappear. Until next time, stay aware and never look away.